Beneath the streets of London, in a room without windows, the night of June 5th, 1944 stretched like an endless breath. The world above was dark and wet rain clawed at the pavement, and far in the distance the wail of air raid sirens rose and fell like the echo of a dying storm. But down here, under layers of reinforced concrete and steel, the air was thick, not with fear, but with decision. The map room of the War Cabinet was lit only by desk lamps, their cones of light casting long shadows over the green felt tables crowded with compasses, telephones and weather charts. Every few seconds a pencil scratched a cigarette, hissed, a clock ticked. It was the sound of history holding its breath. Winston Churchill sat at the head of the long oak table, cigar glowing faintly in the dimness. Around him the most powerful military minds of the free world leaned into the light like men around a campfire before a storm. The Prime Minister had not slept in 30 hours, but fatigue only sharpened the fire in his eyes. The invasion Operation Overlord was less than 12 hours away. 250,000 men were already moving toward the French coast, and in this small underground room their fates were being weighed. Churchill broke the silence first, his voice low but carrying the gravity of empires. "Gentlemen," he said, looking from one face to the next, "what do you truly think will happen tomorrow?" No one spoke at first. They all knew what was at stake. If the invasion failed, the Allies might not recover for years. Europe could remain chained under the swastika until the atomic age itself arrived. Finally, Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, stood up. His uniform was immaculate, but his eyes carried the exhaustion of 5 years of war. He had seen too many plans fail, too many young men buried beneath their own courage. Prime Minister Brooke began voice steady. "The weather is against us. The waves are high, the tides unpredictable. Many of our landing craft are untested in seas like these." He pointed to a set of charts, each marked with wind readings and tidal arrows. "Our meteorologists have given us a narrow window, but if the wind turns again, it will scatter our fleet like driftwood." Churchill listened silent, his cigar now resting in the ashtray. Brooke continued. "The Germans are ready for us, sir. 50,000 men along that coast entrenched behind concrete and steel. Machine guns embedded in bunkers, artillery zeroed in on the beaches. They've had 4 years to prepare, and we're asking our boys to break that in one morning." A murmur passed through the room. Brooke didn't exaggerate, the defences were legendary. The Atlantic Wall, a line of death built by slave labour and German engineers, stretched from Norway to the Spanish border. But Brooke wasn't finished. If even one of our assault waves falters, the entire line could collapse. We might lose 10,000 before noon. He paused, his fingers tightening on the edge of the table. We lost nearly that many in a single morning at Dieppe. The name hung in the air like smoke. 2 years earlier, the Dieppe raid, a test attack on the French coast, had turned into a slaughter. Tanks stranded on the shingle, men gunned down before they reached the seawall ships, burning as they tried to retreat. Out of 6,000 men, more than half were killed, wounded or captured. Churchill remembered the telegrams he'd signed the faces of widows, who never understood why it had happened. That memory still haunted every officer in the room. Brooke exhaled softly. "If we fail tomorrow, sir, it will be Dieppe again, but multiplied by 20. We may not get another chance, not this year, perhaps not in this war." Rain rattled harder against the ventilation shafts above them. The table lamps flickered as the power wavered. Churchill's face was unreadable. He stared at the map of Normandy spread before him like a surgeon studying the body of a dying patient. The beaches had names now: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. Names that sounded almost benign, chosen to disguise the scale of the blood they would soon swallow. For a long moment no one moved. The air smelled of smoke sweat and the faint tang of ozone from the storm outside. Brooke sat down heavily, the sound of his chair scraping against the floor echoing in the cramped space. Around the table, aides exchanged anxious glances. A few officers avoided Churchill's gaze altogether. The weight of Brooke's words settled like a fog, grim rational, impossible to refute. Churchill finally lifted his cigar, studying its ember. "Thank you, Alan," he said softly. "Yours is the counsel of a soldier who has seen too much death to be comforted by promises." No one replied. The clock struck 11. In another hour, paratroopers would begin boarding their aircraft in southern England. The engines of destiny were already turning far beyond the reach of this room. Then, in the stillness, a voice broke through. Calm, confident, unmistakably English. "Prime Minister," said General Bernard Montgomery, rising from his seat, "if I may, there is another way to see it." The men around the table turned toward him, their fatigue giving way to cautious hope. Brooke looked down, his hands clasped. Churchill leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with interest. The first prediction had been spoken, the voice of fear, of reason, of experience. Now came its opposite, the voice of conviction, of audacity, perhaps of madness. Montgomery took a slow breath, the map of Normandy reflected in his eyes. Tomorrow, he said, we will make history one way or another. And in that moment even the rain seemed to pause above London, as if waiting to hear the measure of his faith. Montgomery stood slowly brushing a trace of ash from his sleeve. In the low lamplight his face looked almost serene calm, composed a contrast to the storm gnawing at the walls above. He had the poise of a man who had already fought his war in deserts and dust, who had learned that certainty was sometimes the only armour a commander could wear. His voice when it came was measured and unwavering. "Gentlemen," he began, "we will win." A ripple moved around the table. It wasn't arrogance exactly, it was conviction sharpened by scars. Montgomery had spent the last 2 years turning disasters into victories. At El Alamein, when Britain's back was to the sand, he had rebuilt a demoralised army and driven Rommel's Africa Corps halfway across North Africa. He knew the taste of momentum. To him, battle was not chaos, it was choreography. He rested a hand on the map. The plan is sound. The men are ready. Our coordination is the finest the Empire has ever seen. By midnight tomorrow, the beaches of Normandy will be ours. No one dared interrupt. Only the faint hum of the ventilation system filled the silence. Outside, a lorry rumbled across Whitehall. Somewhere above them, London still lived oblivious to the gamble unfolding below. Montgomery's eyes were bright with a kind of dangerous calm, but victory, he said, will not come cheaply. He drew a folded sheet from his pocket, columns of neat handwriting numbers underlined in blue pencil. We estimate between 8,000 and 12,000 men will be killed or wounded on the first day, 30,000 by the end of the week. These are not guesses, they are the mathematics of liberation. The room tightened. Churchill's gaze shifted from the map to Monty's face. "And you find that acceptable?" he asked quietly. Montgomery didn't flinch. "It is not a question of acceptance, sir. It is a question of necessity. The enemy will not surrender to hope, only to force. Every mile of that coastline will have to be purchased in blood, in steel, in courage. There is no other currency." The words fell heavy, but there was a strange comfort in his certainty. Monty's confidence was contagious, even when terrifying. It was the opposite of Brooke's weary realism, where one saw the abyss, the other saw the bridge across it. He straightened, clasping his hands behind his back. "Gentlemen, our soldiers are not the boys of Dunkirk anymore. They are hardened, disciplined, and led by experience. We have air supremacy. We have artillery the Germans cannot match." And this time he tapped the table for emphasis, we have learned. That last word carried more meaning than any statistic. The ghosts of 1940 stirred in the silence. Dunkirk, Tobruk, Singapore. Years when Britain had stumbled, fought alone, and bled without victory. Yet somehow, through ration lines and bombed-out streets, the country had endured, and now at last it stood ready not just to survive but to strike back. Montgomery's voice softened, almost reflective. "We've been preparing for this since the first bombs fell on London. Every factory worker, every nurse, every pilot, every act of endurance was a rehearsal for tomorrow. It's not just an invasion, it's the end of retreat." He let the words hang, then looked to Churchill. "We've rebuilt our army, our spirit, our faith. I do not promise you an easy day, but I promise you a decisive one." For a moment even Brooke seemed moved. There was something hypnotic about Monty's certainty. He spoke like a man narrating a victory already written in the future, merely waiting to unfold. His reputation allowed him that privilege. Some called it arrogance, others necessity. The men of the Eighth Army had once said, "Monty tells us what we already believe," and that belief had carried them across continents. Churchill leaned back in his chair, the tip of his cigar glowing red. He wanted to believe this man to surrender to the comfort of inevitability. But in the stillness between words, the Prime Minister's mind returned to his oldest torment, the arithmetic of command. He thought of letters that would have to be written to mothers, of names that would be spoken once on the wireless, and then forgotten. Montgomery sensed it. "War," he said gently, "is never kind to those who must measure it. But leadership is not the art of comfort, sir, it is the art of endurance. If we hesitate, we lose not only this chance, but perhaps the entire generation's faith in victory. The men who land tomorrow will do so knowing that we believed in them." The table was quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Less dread, more resolve. The map seemed to glow faintly in the lamplight, the red lines of planned landing shimmering like veins of destiny. Churchill nodded slowly as if sealing something unseen. "Very well, Monty," he murmured. "You speak with the fire of St. George himself. May the dragon be listening?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through the officers. The sound broke the tension like glass fleeting but human. Churchill crushed the ash from his cigar, then turned toward the far end of the table, toward the man who had said nothing at all. There sat General Dwight D. Eisenhower, his shoulders slightly hunched, the lines under his eyes deep as trenches. His cap lay beside a folder of reports he hadn't touched. He had listened to every word in silence, hands clasped, gaze fixed on the map. 2 visions had been laid before him, one of disaster, one of victory bought at terrible cost. The room waited for his judgment. The ticking clock seemed louder now. Churchill broke the stillness. "General Eisenhower," he said quietly, "you've heard both sides. What do you believe will happen when the sun rises over Normandy?" Eisenhower didn't look up right away. When he finally did, his voice was low but clear. "Prime Minister," he said, "they're both wrong." The room froze. Even the lamps seemed to flicker in disbelief. And in that silence the course of the next century began to shift. For several seconds no one moved. The hum of the ventilation fans and the distant thunder above London were the only sounds left. Eisenhower's words, "They're both wrong," hung in the air like an unexploded shell. The American general sat still at the far end of the table, elbows resting on the wood, his face drawn and pale beneath the dim light. He had the look of a man who had not truly slept in weeks. For 3 months he had lived inside maps, memos, and forecasts, every variable of weather, tide, and timing spinning through his mind like gears in a machine that could not be stopped. When he finally rose, he moved without drama. His voice was low, but the room fell into a deeper silence, as though every sound in London had retreated underground to listen. "Gentlemen," he began, "the truth is that this invasion will not be decided by storms or guns, or even by how many men reach the beach in the first wave." He glanced at Brooke and Montgomery in turn. "You are both right in part, and that is why you're both wrong." He crossed to the wall where the great map of Normandy stretched from Cherbourg to the Seine. Coloured pins and strings traced the arteries of an operation so immense that even now few in the room could truly comprehend it. Eisenhower pointed to the 5 beaches marked in red pencil. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno Sword. 5 names for one gamble. "Here," he said, tapping the coastline with his pointer, "the tide will fall faster than expected. The sand is soft, vehicles may bog down. Inland his hand swept eastward are the bocage, the hedgerows. Miles of tangled earth walls that will slow every tank we land." He stepped back, eyes narrowing. "But none of that will decide the outcome. Not really. It will come down to one decision by one man in one room hundreds of miles away." Churchill frowned. Hitler Eisenhower nodded. "Yes, sir. Adolf Hitler. He has armoured divisions waiting inland panzer units, the best Germany has left. The 12th SS, the 21st Panzer, the Panzerlehr division. If he sends them to Normandy in the first 12 hours, we lose." Montgomery shifted, incredulous. "Lose. Even with our air power," Eisenhower's gaze was unflinching. "Air power can slow them but not stop them. If those divisions hit our men before we establish a beachhead, we'll be thrown back into the sea. It's that simple." For a moment no one spoke. The realization crept through the room like cold air through a crack in the wall. All their months of planning the fleets of ships and gliders, the coded orders and prayers, all of it rested on a single human decision, inside the mind of an enemy they could neither predict nor control. Eisenhower let that sink in before continuing. "If Hitler hesitates, if he doubts, even for half a day we win. Because once we get ashore and link the beaches, no power on earth can push us back." He turned away from the map. The lamplight caught the fatigue lines around his eyes. "This invasion," he said quietly, "depends on arrogance, his arrogance. He must believe he knows better than his generals, and I believe he does." Churchill leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You're betting the fate of Europe on that." Eisenhower allowed himself the faintest smile. "We've been preparing him for this bet for months, sir." He hesitated then, and his voice softened. "But make no mistake, if it fails, the responsibility is mine, entirely mine." The men exchanged glances, startled by the weight of those words. They didn't yet know that in the drawer of Eisenhower's field desk there already lay a handwritten note dated June 5th, 1944. Its first line read, "Our landings have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. Any blame or fault that is attached to this attempt is mine alone." He had written it by lamplight, then folded it carefully, never expecting it to be read. That knowledge gave his calm a different gravity. This was not the bravado of command, it was the acceptance of personal ruin if the gamble went wrong. Eisenhower returned to the table, fingers tracing the edge of the map as if feeling the shape of history itself. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "the sky over Normandy will be full of our paratroopers. The beaches will burn with artillery, but that is only the visible part of the battle. The invisible part has already begun." Brooke frowned. "Invisible, yes," Eisenhower said. "A deception. A grand one. We've convinced Hitler that the real invasion will come at Calais, not Normandy. We've fed him lies for months. When the first reports reach his headquarters, he'll think they're a diversion. He'll wait, and that hesitation will decide the world." He paused, eyes distant for a moment, as if picturing at the moment the enemy would misread reality itself. A decision Hitler doesn't yet know he must make. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. Even Churchill, who had long prided himself on his steel, felt the enormity of it. He leaned back, cigar forgotten in his fingers. "Then why attempt it at all?" he asked quietly. "If so much depends on what one madman believes, why not wait for certainty?" Eisenhower's gaze met his. "Because, sir," he said, voice steady in war, "there is no certainty. Only momentum, and if we don't strike now, the tide that carries us forward may never come again." The words seemed to echo off the walls of the bunker, reverberating through the maps and the cigarette smoke and the exhausted faces. In that moment, even the clock stopped mattering. The invasion was already set in motion, not by weather, not by luck, but by the strange faith that one man's delusion could open the gate to freedom. Outside, the rain eased. Somewhere far above, the first engines began to warm in the English airfields. Eisenhower unrolled a second map, this one not of Normandy, but of England. It looked different, scattered with ghost divisions, imaginary airfields, phantom fleets. "This," he said, "is how we've been lying to Hitler." The officers leaned forward. Churchill adjusted his spectacles, eyes narrowing. Eisenhower pointed to the southeastern corner of the map, Kent, Sussex, Dover, the closest point to France across the Channel. "Here," he said, "tapping the cluster of markings, we've built an entire army that doesn't exist." The room stirred with disbelief. "An army," Churchill echoed. "Yes, sir," Eisenhower replied. "On paper, on film, and in the airwaves, we call it the 1st U.S. Army Group under the command of General George S. Patton." Even Brooke raised an eyebrow. Patton, the most aggressive general in the Allied ranks, was perfect bait. To German intelligence, he was the embodiment of the coming blow, loud, impulsive, and merciless. The kind of man Hitler would expect to lead the real invasion. Eisenhower continued, voice measured but laced with quiet pride. "We've given him an entire ghost force, inflatable tanks made of rubber and canvas, wooden aircraft parked on empty fields, dummy landing craft anchored along the Thames estuary. And every night a chorus of false radio traffic fills the air." He gestured toward the radio officer in the corner, who nodded. "Code clerks transmit fake orders 24 hours a day, weather reports, supply requests, messages about imaginary divisions. German intercept operators pick them up, analyze them, and send them straight to Berlin. They believe every word." Churchill leaned forward. Cigar forgotten, his expression somewhere between admiration and disbelief. "You've created an army of shadows," Eisenhower smiled faintly. "An army of shadows that Hitler fears more than our real one." Then he reached into a folder and drew out several black and white reconnaissance photos. They showed neat rows of tanks glinting in the English sun, long lines of landing craft on open beaches. "These were taken by German spy planes just last week," Eisenhower said. "Every one of those tanks is hollow. Every one of those ships is plywood." The officers murmured in astonishment. For a moment the room felt lighter, almost conspiratorial, as if they were all participants in a grand theatrical trick staged before the eyes of the enemy. But Eisenhower's tone grew graver. "The deception goes deeper than props. Every German spy in Britain, every single one, has been turned. They now work for us." The statement silenced even the hum of the room. "All of them?" Brooke asked. "All of them," Eisenhower confirmed. "Some willingly, some under threat, some for money. But every message the Abwehr receives from England is now written by our own people." He paused, letting the enormity settle. There's a man named Juan Pujol, codenamed Garbo. He sends reports to Berlin from a network of 27 imaginary agents. He describes troop movements that never happen, warehouses that don't exist, convoys that vanish into the fog. The Germans trust him completely. They call him their most reliable source. Churchill's eyes gleamed. Remarkable. The Spaniard who fooled an empire. Eisenhower nodded. And he's not alone. We have illusionists from the theatre, painters from the Royal Academy, engineers from the film studios, all working under camouflage command. They've built fake runways lined with decoy planes, painted whole fields to resemble airstrips from the air. Even the reflections on hangar roofs are simulated. Montgomery gave a quiet chuckle. The greatest stage play in history. Perhaps Eisenhower said, but one that must not break character. Every line, every prop, every silence matters. If even a single piece of this illusion cracks, the Germans will know the truth, and our men will die for it. Churchill stared at the photographs again. The deception was so vast it bordered on madness. Yet it made a strange kind of sense. In modern war, imagination had become as lethal as artillery. Truth itself had turned into a weapon sharpened by secrecy. He looked up at Eisenhower. "You're telling me the fate of Europe depends on how well we act our part." Eisenhower met his gaze. "Yes, sir. For 6 months we've been performing for an audience of one man, and tomorrow we find out if he believed the show." A faint rumble vibrated through the floor, an air raid siren in the distance fading into the London night. It sounded almost like applause from a darkened theatre. Churchill smiled faintly. War, it seems, has its playwrights. Eisenhower folded the map. And its critics, he said, "Hitler is the only one who matters now. If he buys the lie, the beachhead stands. If he doesn't, the channel runs red." He placed the photographs back into their envelope and straightened. "Gentlemen, everything now depends on faith, not in God, but in deception." The lights flickered once briefly. No one spoke. In the silence that followed, the weight of the gamble pressed down like the storm clouds over England. Outside on the airfields from Dorset to Portsmouth, the engines of thousands of planes waited in the darkness. Real planes this time, fueled and ready. Eisenhower looked at his watch. "It's time," he said softly. "The first paratroopers are already boarding." And with that the meeting dissolved into motion orders, relayed telephones ringing, footsteps echoing through the bunker corridors. But as Churchill paused by the door, he glanced back at the empty map table. The fake army in Kent, the real one in Normandy. It was all part of the same truth that the greatest battles are not fought only with bullets, but with belief. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the world shifted. Over the English Channel, the darkness came alive with the roar of engines. Hundreds of C-47 transport planes cut through the mist, carrying paratroopers whose faces were streaked with black grease and silent fear. Beneath them, the sea boiled with motion, 5,000 ships surging toward the French coast, their wakes like white scars across the water. The invasion had begun. To the men in those landing craft, the horizon looked like fire. Allied battleships thundered from miles offshore, their shells tearing the sky apart. The beaches, Utah Omaha gold, Juno Sword glowed with muzzle flashes as German machine guns opened up, carving the dawn with lines of red light. Bodies hit the surf, helmets floated like black stones in the tide. Yet slowly, relentlessly, the Allied troops pressed forward step by step through the storm. In England, Eisenhower listened for reports that came in bursts of static. Every message carried the same refrain: heavy resistance, severe casualties, no retreat. By noon, the beaches were chaos incarnate, but they were still held. That was the miracle, not that men survived, but that they refused to stop dying for a few more yards of sand. While this slaughter unfolded on the French coast, another battle, an invisible one, was being lost hundreds of miles away in a quiet Bavarian forest. At Berghof, Adolf Hitler's Alpine retreat, the Führer slept through the most critical morning of the war. The first reports of landings reached his headquarters at 4 a.m. Luftwaffe radar stations confirmed hundreds of incoming aircraft. Coastal garrisons were calling for artillery support. Yet none of his generals dared to wake him. They had seen what happened to officers who brought him bad news. By 5 a.m., the situation map in the operations room at OKW, the German High Command, was covered in frantic notes. Paratroopers sighted near Sainte-Mère-Église, Allied ships shelling Caen, messages coming faster than they could be deciphered. But still no word from the Führer. Field Marshal Keitel rubbed his temples. "We must wake him," he whispered. "This may be the main attack." General Jodl, ever cautious, shook his head. He was clear, Keitel. The real invasion will come at Calais. These reports, they fit the pattern of a diversion. He pointed to the intelligence summaries Hitler himself had approved weeks earlier, reports fed to Berlin by double agents like Garbo. Every line had reinforced the same belief that the true Allied thrust would come across the narrowest point of the Channel. Normandy was too far, too exposed, too illogical. At 6:30 a.m., as the first wave at Omaha Beach was being annihilated, the German 7th Army in France begged for permission to move its panzer divisions to the coast. But the chain of command was paralysed. Only Hitler could release the armoured reserves. His generals could only wait and hope he awoke in time. When Hitler finally stirred, the sun was already high over the Alps. It was close to noon. He took his breakfast slowly, oblivious to the disaster forming on the Atlantic coast. When his aide finally presented the situation map, he frowned, chewing absent-mindedly on a piece of bread. Landing at Normandy, he murmured, "Impossible." The room stayed silent. "This is not the real invasion," he said, brushing the report aside. "It's a feint. The main attack will come at Calais under Patton." His staff exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared argue. The legend of Patton's phantom army still haunted their assessments. The deception had worked too well. Hitler believed in his own infallibility more than in his officers' eyes. By early afternoon, while Allied tanks were crawling inland under smoke and ash, the German panzers still sat idle near Paris. Field commanders begged for action. One colonel reportedly slammed his fist against the table. "If we do nothing, the war is lost," he shouted. But his superior silenced him with a single glance. To act without Hitler's order was treason. In Normandy, German soldiers fought bravely, but their courage could not repair their leader's blindness. They were trapped in a web of hierarchy and fear. The German command structure split between the OKW, OKH, and regional field commands was a maze of delay. Each division needed signatures from men too frightened to make them. Every hour of hesitation bled the Reich of its last chance to hold the West. At 3:00 p.m., Hitler finally gave permission to move the 12th SS Panzer Division, but the order came too late. Allied air superiority turned the roads into death traps. Columns of tanks were shredded by rocket fire before they ever reached the coast. The Luftwaffe could barely respond. Fuel was gone, pilots scarce, the once mighty Air Force now a ghost of itself. Inside Hitler's headquarters, the tone shifted from denial to disbelief. Reports flooded in Carentan fallen, bridges secured, paratroopers linking up with seaborne forces, yet Hitler paced the room muttering, "The real invasion is still to come. They're trying to draw me out." To those around him it felt like madness, but no one called it that aloud. The entire German war machine had been built on obedience, not reason. They were trapped inside one man's delusion, watching the empire crumble, hour by hour. That night, as the thunder of naval guns rolled across the Channel, a young German officer named Hans von Linger, standing near the communications desk, whispered to a colleague, "If this is not the real invasion, then perhaps nothing in this war ever was." His words went unrecorded, but they captured the moment perfectly, the dawning recognition that the Reich was paralysed not by force of arms, but by fear of its own leader. By the time the first panzer formations reached the outskirts of Caen, the beaches were secured. Allied engineers had already begun unloading trucks, artillery and bulldozers. The bridgehead was solid. Eisenhower's gamble had paid off not through divine luck, but through the enemy's arrogance. Somewhere in the silence after midnight in the bunker at Berghof, a messenger approached Hitler with the latest intelligence summary. He hesitated before speaking. "Mein Führer," he said softly, "there is still no sign of the main attack at Calais." Hitler looked up, eyes unfocused as if he hadn't heard. Outside, thunder rolled through the Bavarian hills. By then, the war in the West was already lost, and it had been lost not in a firefight or a storm, but in the quiet hours of disbelief when a dictator chose his pride over reality. By dawn on June 7, 1944, the beaches of Normandy no longer belonged to the sea. They belonged to history. Smoke hung low over the coast, drifting in grey ribbons that smelled of cordite salt and death. The tide had receded, revealing a shoreline littered with wreckage, burned-out landing craft, shattered helmets, bodies tangled in barbed wire. But behind that devastation, the impossible had happened. Nearly 150,000 Allied troops were ashore. They had clawed their way through the sand, the minefields, and the storm of German gunfire, and now they were digging in. Engineers built roads over wrecked vehicles, medics turned overturned landing craft into makeshift hospitals, and artillerymen, mud-caked sleepless, deafened, kept firing inland toward the hedgerows of Normandy. One British sergeant later wrote, "It was as if the entire coastline breathed. Every crater smoked, every man moved, every heartbeat belonged to something larger than us." The numbers told a story too vast for imagination. In the first 24 hours, more than 7,000 ships and landing craft had crossed the Channel. Allied losses were brutal, around 10,000 casualties, including over 4,000 dead, but the beachhead held. The Atlantic Wall, once touted as impregnable, was cracked open by courage, deception, and the arithmetic of logistics. The German prisoners who stumbled into Allied lines that afternoon were dazed. Many were teenagers, trembling, covered in sand and blood, their disbelief written across their faces. One captured lieutenant muttered through broken English, "It was supposed to be Calais." They said this was only a diversion. His words became a summary of the Reich's greatest self-inflicted wound. As the sun rose higher, the full scale of the operation began to emerge. By noon, more than 2,500 tanks and vehicles had landed. 13,000 paratroopers had linked with seaborne forces, and behind them, the lifeline of the invasion was already flowing. Floating harbours called mulberries, each the size of a city block, were being towed across the Channel. They would soon unload thousands of tons of supplies per day, food, fuel, ammunition, hope. While the front lines bled behind them, unfolded one of the quietest triumphs of the war, the logistics miracle. In a field near Portsmouth, American quartermaster officers huddled over chalkboards calculating tonnage and tide schedules with the precision of mathematicians. British supply ships queued in perfect order across the Channel, timed to the minute. Thousands of vehicles had been waterproofed for the crossing, each labelled, indexed, and tracked by clerks who hadn't slept in days. Even the fuel flowed through a pipe laid under the Sea Operation Pluto, the pipeline that fed the liberation of Europe. It was, as one American officer said, war reduced to science and science raised to faith. In the midst of that controlled chaos, human stories threaded through the machinery of victory. A medic on Omaha Beach worked for 20 hours without pause, cutting bandages from his own uniform. A chaplain baptized a dying soldier with rainwater from a helmet. A Royal Navy signalman, his eyes red from the glare, wrote in his diary, "We expected death." What we didn't expect was how calmly everyone faced it. Far away in Bavaria, Hitler's composure cracked. Reports poured in of Allied breakthroughs. Bridges secured ports held German counterattacks smashed by naval gunfire. The Führer paced and raged, screaming for explanations that no one could give. He accused his generals of betrayal, his intelligence service of incompetence. To him it was inconceivable that his army had been outwitted not by strength, but by deceit. He ordered counter-offensives that no longer existed, divisions already destroyed reserves that would never arrive. His words became empty commands to a ghost army. That night, as the first Allied supply convoys unloaded under the moonlight, Eisenhower walked among the men at the beachhead. He spoke little, only brief words of encouragement, but the soldiers recognized something in his silence, relief edged with disbelief. Against every forecast, they had survived the longest day. He stopped beside a medic crouched over a wounded German. The man was giving the enemy soldier morphine. Eisenhower watched for a moment, then said quietly, "We came to end this, not to become it. It was that difference, the refusal to hate, the calm professionalism, even in chaos, that turned victory into something more than conquest." The Allies had not merely breached a coastline, they had breached the myth of Nazi invincibility. By nightfall, the beachheads were linked. The air was filled with the clatter of shovels and the grind of engines as bulldozers cleared paths inland. The wounded were carried to hospital ships glowing softly on the horizon. The sea, which had been crimson at dawn, turned black and still under the stars. Somewhere across that dark water, Churchill received the latest communiqué. It was short, almost understated. "The troops have got ashore." He set his cigar down and closed his eyes. For a long moment the old lion said nothing. He had seen too many false dawns in this war to rejoice easily. But this one he knew would not fade. Because on that day, the 6th of June 1944, Germany had not just lost a battle, it had lost the West. And in the quiet of that night, as the surf washed over the wreckage, history itself began to turn. This is not the real invasion. 6 words that sealed the fate of an empire. 6 words that revealed more about the mind of Adolf Hitler than all his speeches and armies combined. They were the words of a man who could no longer see truth, only his own reflection in it. That morning, when the first paratroopers fell over Normandy and the beaches burned beneath Allied fire, Hitler's delusion held stronger than any bunker wall. The man who once reshaped Europe by sheer willpower had become a prisoner of his own certainty. The irony was brutal. He had built his regime on fear, and it was fear his generals' fear of him that kept them from waking him when it mattered most. In every dictatorship, truth becomes the enemy long before defeat arrives. By 1944, no one around Hitler dared question him. His word had replaced reality. Intelligence officers filtered reports to match what he wanted to hear. Generals shaped their plans to flatter his fantasies, and so when the Allies struck at Normandy, the German war machine, once the most disciplined on earth, froze in confusion waiting for a leader who was dreaming. This is not the real invasion. The phrase was more than a mistake. It was a metaphor for every failure of tyranny. Denial had become a habit. Arrogance, a religion. Hitler's empire was collapsing, but his mind refused to allow it. He believed his genius was infallible, that he understood his enemies better than they understood themselves. In truth, it was that very belief that destroyed him. Eisenhower had gambled on Hitler's pride, and he was right. In the end, the invasion wasn't won by technology, or even by courage, it was won by psychology. By the ability to see into the enemy's blindness. The Allies studied him, mimicked him, anticipated him until he became predictable, until his certainty became his weakness. The greatest military deception in history succeeded not because of how well the Allies lied, but because of how deeply Hitler needed to believe those lies. His refusal to question his own convictions turned a battlefield into a graveyard of illusions. And yet, within that tragedy lies a timeless lesson. Leadership without humility becomes a form of blindness. Power that silences dissent is not strength, it is decay. When a nation fears to speak truth to its ruler, it builds its own defeat brick by brick until one morning the enemy no longer needs to conquer it. It collapses from within. Churchill understood this. So did Eisenhower, and even the cautious Brooke and the proud Montgomery. Each had wrestled with doubt, yet none let ego drown reason. They argued, listened, disagreed, but they did not hide from truth. Their strength was not certainty, but clarity, the courage to see things as they were and still act. History remembers the thunder of guns and the sweep of armies, but it often forgets the quieter moments, the midnight meetings, the sleepless commanders, the choices made between pride and prudence. The true war was always fought inside the human mind, between arrogance and awareness, between obedience and conscience, between illusion and reality. As dusk fell over Normandy that evening, the guns finally began to fade. The tide rolled in gentle and indifferent, washing over the scars of the greatest gamble ever made. Among the wreckage, soldiers sat in silence, some writing letters, home others staring toward the horizon, unsure if they had survived victory or merely postponed death. The sky burned orange, then purple, then black, and somewhere beyond that horizon, in a mountain fortress far from the front, a dictator stared at maps that no longer meant anything. He had conquered half the world, yet he could not master himself. The guns thundered in Normandy, but Germany's defeat began in silence behind a locked door where no one dared to knock.